What would you do if the key to your future and the buried secrets of an entire county were hidden inside a dusty old book no one else wanted? Imagine winning a dead cattle baron's handwritten ledger at a packed estate auction for just $11. The sound of laughter echoing in your ears as you claim your prize. For 22-year-old Jane Alcott, that laughter was the loneliest sound in the world. But the truth waiting inside that leather-bound book was a secret so powerful, it would rewrite the maps and fortunes of everyone who had dismissed her. Settle in and let us know in the comments where you're watching from, because this is a story about how the most overlooked things often hold the most value. Jane Alcott stood at the back of the Cheyenne auction house, a ghost in her own life. The air was thick with the smell of cigar smoke, old paper, and the cloying sweetness of perfume worn by the wives of men who had come to pick over the bones of Silas Croft's empire. Jane felt the weight of her 22 years as if they were 60. Her hands, raw and chapped from work that no longer existed, were tucked into the pockets of her father's worn duster. It was all she had left of him, this coat and the quiet ache in her chest that had been a constant companion since they'd laid him in the ground 2 months prior. His ranch, the Alcott homestead that had been the only world she'd ever known, had been swallowed by the same man whose worldly goods were now being scattered to the highest bidder, Silas Croft. The name was a bitter stone in her throat. She had come today not to buy, but to watch, to see the end of the man who had authored her own ending. She had 3 $20 gold pieces sewn into the lining of her coat, and another $11 in worn bills in her pocket. Money that was supposed to last her until she found work in a town that had no work for a woman who knew horses and land, but not much else. The auctioneer's voice was a rhythmic drone, a litany of power and possession. He sold off Croft's mahogany desk, his silver spurs, his herd of prize-winning bulls, each item fetching a price that could have saved her father's ranch 10 times over. With every rap of the gavel, a piece of Croft's legacy was hammered into a new owner's hands, and Jane felt a hollow sort of justice. The man had collected things, land, cattle, people's debts, and now his collection was being dispersed like dust in the wind. She watched Sterling Croft, Silas's son, preening in the front row. He was a man made of soft edges and expensive fabric, his face smooth and unlined by sun or worry. He bid on nothing, merely observed with an air of bored entitlement, as if this were all a formality before the true inheritance. The land, the banknotes, the power, was settled into his name. Jane's gaze drifted over the tables piled with lesser items, the forgotten artifacts of a life, and then she saw it. It was part of a lot of miscellaneous office supplies, a tarnished inkwell, a handful of dried-up pens, and a thick, leather-bound book described by the auctioneer as one personal accounts ledger, contents unknown, likely of little value. The book was plain, its dark green leather scuffed at the corners, the spine unbroken but tired. While the bidders leaned forward for a gilded mirror or a pearl-handled pistol, they slumped back in their chairs for this. Sterling Croft let out a short, dismissive laugh that was audible even at the back of the room. He murmured something to the man beside him, and a ripple of amusement spread through the front rows. A ledger, a book of numbers. In a world of cattle and land, it was less than nothing. A relic. The auctioneer, sensing the room's disinterest, tried to inject some energy. "Do I hear $20 for this lot? A piece of history, gentlemen. The very book where the great Silas Croft recorded his dealings. $20? Silence. 10 then. Do I hear 10? A man in the third row yawned. Jane felt a strange pull, a current of defiance she hadn't felt since her father's funeral. That book had been on Croft's desk. It had been in his hands. Her father's name might be in the book, a single-line item in the long list of men he'd ruined. Owning it felt like a small, private reclamation. It was a foolish thought, born of grief and anger. But it took root. $5? The auctioneer pleaded. Jane's heart began to beat a little faster. She thought of the $11 in her pocket. It was meant for food, for a week's rent in a rooming house. But what was a week? Another 7 days of being a ghost. "I'll bid $5, a man near the front said, his voice bored. He was likely buying the inkwell. "I have 5. Do I hear 6? Jane's hand trembled as she raised it just high enough to be seen. Her voice was raspy from disuse. $6. Heads turned. A few people squinted, trying to place the girl in the oversized coat. Sterling Croft's gaze swept over her, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. He didn't know her, but he knew her type. Dust, poverty, irrelevance. The man who had bid 5 shook his head, uninterested in a contest. "I have $6 from the young lady in the back. Do I hear 7? There was a long pause. Then, a man aiming to irritate Sterling, or perhaps just for sport, called out, $10. Sterling Croft smiled thinly. The game was on. The auctioneer's energy returned. $10! Now we're moving! Do I hear 11? All eyes were on Jane. Her face burned. This was foolish. It was grocery money. It was survival. But the image of her father's face, etched with worry in the lamplight as he looked over his own failing books, flashed in her mind. 11, she said, her voice clearer this time. The word hung in the air. The man who had bid 10 shrugged and turned away. The sport was over. The auctioneer looked around the room. "Sold," he declared, his gavel cracking against the podium. "For $11. To the young lady at the back." A wave of soft, condescending laughter washed over the room. Jane Alcott had just spent her last free dollar on a dead man's worthless diary. What was she thinking? Was it a desperate grasp at a past she couldn't reclaim? Or did some deeper instinct guide her hand? What secrets could possibly be hiding in a simple book of numbers? Let us know what you would have done in the comments below. And if you're enjoying our story, please consider subscribing for more tales of hidden history. Now, as Jane stepped forward to claim her prize, the weight of the world's judgment felt almost as heavy as the book itself. The laughter followed her as she walked to the clerk's table, a hot wave of shame at her back. She counted out the worn bills and a handful of coins, her hands shaking slightly. The clerk, a man with a green visor and an impatient air, barely looked at her as he pushed the lot across the polished wood. She ignored the inkwell and pens, her focus entirely on the ledger. It was heavier than she'd expected, dense with paper and secrets. The leather was cool and smooth beneath her fingers. She tucked it under her arm, the book's hard edge a comfort against her side. As she turned to leave, her path was blocked by Sterling Croft. He stood with his hands in the pockets of his tailored waistcoat, a look of amused pity on his face. "Quite the treasure you've unearthed," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. The men with him chuckled. Jane said nothing, her gaze fixed on a point just past his shoulder. She wanted only to be away from this place, away from these people. "Tell you what," Sterling continued, lowering his voice into a conspiratorial whisper. "My father was a sentimental man. I'd hate to see his scribblings discarded. I'll give you $20 for it. Double your money. You can buy yourself a decent meal." He made it sound like an act of charity, but his eyes were cold. It was a power play, a final dismissal. He was offering to buy back his father's trash to prove how little it, and by extension she, mattered. The offer was tempting. $20 was a fortune. It was safety. It was another 2 weeks of life. But looking at his smug face, Jane felt that flicker of defiance harden into resolve. This book was the one thing in Silas Croft's empire that his son hadn't wanted, and now it was hers. "No, thank you," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I'll keep it." Sterling's smile tightened. He hadn't expected to be refused. "Suit yourself," he sneered. "I'm sure it will make for fascinating reading." He stepped aside, and Jane walked past him, her head held high, not letting herself hurry until she was through the double doors and back in the bracing Wyoming air. The town of Cheyenne was a swirl of dust and noise, but she felt utterly alone. She started walking toward the livery stable at the edge of town, the only place she could afford to keep her father's old horse. As she passed a narrow alleyway, a voice, dry as autumn leaves, stopped her. "Some men write their sins in ink," the voice said. "Others write them in dust. Croft wrote his in both." Jane turned to see an old Shoshone woman sitting on an apple crate, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, a clay pipe held loosely in one hand. She was wrapped in a trade blanket, her dark eyes fixed on the ledger under Jane's arm. Jane didn't know what to say. The woman's gaze was not unkind, but it was heavy, filled with a knowledge that felt ancient. The woman gave a slow, deliberate nod. "You mind what you read in that book, girl? A man's accounts tell you what he bought. His secrets tell you what he owned." Before Jane could form a question, the woman turned her attention back to the street, as if their conversation was already a thing of the past. The cryptic warning settled over Jane, a strange and unsettling premonition. She clutched the ledger tighter and continued on her way, the whispers of the townspeople seeming to follow her, their words of pity and mockery fading into the vast, indifferent Wyoming wind. She reached the livery stable as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised shades of orange and purple. The scent of hay, horses, and old leather was a balm to her frayed nerves. It was the smell of home. At the far end of the stable, in the last stall, was Pilgrim. Her father's horse was a tall gelding, his coat the color of worn buckskin, his muzzle gone gray with age. He lifted his head as she approached, his large, dark eyes soft and knowing. He blew a warm breath into her outstretched hand, a silent greeting that spoke more than words ever could. "Hey, old friend," she murmured, stroking his neck. He was her last link to her past, the only living creature who had known her father's touch as well as she had. The stable owner, a kind but weary man named Gus, who had known her family for years, had agreed to let her keep Pilgrim there in exchange for her mucking out stalls. He also let her use a small, windowless tack room in the back, a space barely large enough for a cot and a small wood stove. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. As night fell, Jane lit a single kerosene lantern, its golden light pushing back the deep shadows of the room. The air grew cold quickly. She sat on the edge of her cot, Pilgrim shifting and sighing softly in the stall just outside her door, a comforting, rhythmic presence. She placed the heavy ledger on her lap. For a long moment, she just looked at it. The laughter from the auction house echoed in her ears. Sterling Croft's mocking face swam in her memory. Had she made a terrible mistake? Wasted her last dollars on a dead man's forgotten paperwork out of foolish pride? With a deep breath, she opened the cover. The first page was blank, save for a single stark inscription in the center. S.C. His mark and his measure. She turned the page. The paper was thick, high-quality stock, filled with line after line of dense, spidery handwriting. It was a dizzying array of dates, names, and numbers. At first glance, it was exactly what everyone had assumed it to be, a meticulous record of ranching business. May 3rd, 1884. To Miller's Crossing, 200 head. Feed cost, $40. Sold, $3,200. May 5th, 1884. From Silas Blackwood, 12 tons hay. Cost, $60. It went on and on, page after page, a meticulous, almost obsessive record of every transaction, every head of cattle, every bag of feed. Her heart sank. It was nothing. Just a book of numbers. The townspeople were right. She had bought a piece of trash. She flipped through the pages, a growing sense of disappointment washing over her. She saw the names of ranchers she knew, men who had prospered under Croft's shadow, and men who had failed. It was all there, a dry accounting of the economics that governed their lives. She felt foolish and exhausted, the emotional high of her defiance crashing into the hard reality of her situation. She was alone in a cold room with a useless book and a future that was a perfect, terrifying blank. The lantern flame flickered, casting long, dancing shadows on the wall. Outside, the wind began to howl, a lonely sound that matched the emptiness inside her. She was about to close the ledger and surrender to sleep when a familiar name caught her eye. It was a name she knew well, and it shouldn't have been there. The name was Jedediah Stone. He had been their neighbor to the west, a good man with a small herd and a smaller portion of luck. He had lost his ranch last spring after the fever took half his cattle. Jane remembered the day he and his family had loaded their wagon and headed east, their faces grim with defeat. His entry in the ledger was dated just a week before he left. It was simple, almost cryptic. Jedediah Stone, 200. Next to the number was a small, meticulously drawn symbol, a single, straight fence post with 2 strands of wire wrapped around it. It made no sense. 200 what? Cattle? He'd never had that many. Dollars? It was far too little to save his ranch, and far too much for a simple loan without explanation. And the drawing of the fence post was bizarre, a piece of idle doodling in a book that was otherwise ruthlessly efficient. Jane stared at the entry, a frown creasing her brow. It was an anomaly, a detail that refused to fit the pattern of the rest of the ledger. She had spent her life on a ranch. She knew how records were kept. You noted what was sold, what was bought, the price, the date. You didn't add cryptic numbers and little pictures. She ran her finger over the entry, the ink slightly raised against the smooth paper. It felt deliberate, important. She put the book down and paced the small room, the floorboards creaking under her worn boots. The old Shoshone woman's words came back to her. A man's accounts tell you what he bought. His secrets tell you what he owned. Was this a secret? She went back to the ledger, her initial disappointment replaced by a flicker of intense curiosity. She began to scan the pages not for what made sense, but for what didn't. She started looking for other entries, like Jedediah's, a name followed by a number and a strange, small symbol. It took nearly an hour, but she found another. Abigail Finch, 50. Next to it, a tiny, perfect drawing of a water bucket. Abigail Finch was a widow who owned the town's only laundry service. $50 was a significant sum for her. What could it mean? And the bucket? Then another. Marcus Thorne. 500. Next to it, the outline of a branding iron, the brand itself left blank. Marcus Thorne owned the smithy. He'd had to sell his prize stallion a few months ago to cover a debt. Jane's mind raced. These weren't business transactions. They were something else. They felt personal. A list of debts, perhaps? But they weren't recorded like any debts she had ever seen. There were no terms, no interest rates, no due dates, just a name, a number, and a symbol. It was a code. And Silas Croft was the only one who had held the key. The wind rattled the loose-fitting door of the tack room, and Pilgrim nickered softly in his stall, a low, comforting sound in the deep quiet of the night. Jane felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. She was on the edge of something. She could feel it. A truth hidden in plain sight, dismissed by everyone as worthless. She didn't yet understand what she was looking at, but she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that this book was no mere diary. It was a reckoning. The next morning, Jane rose before dawn, her mind sharp with a purpose she hadn't felt in months. She left Pilgrim with fresh hay and water, promising she'd be back soon. With the ledger tucked safely inside her coat, she walked through the sleeping town to the county clerk's office. She spent 2 of her precious dollars on the largest, most detailed map of Elkhorn County they had. It was a sprawling sheet of paper showing every registered parcel of land, every river, every road, from the town of Cheyenne to the distant mountains. Back in the quiet solitude of her tack room, she unrolled the map on the floor, weighting its corners with a hammer, a spare horseshoe, and 2 flat stones. The lantern cast a pool of light over the intricate lines and names. With the ledger open beside her, she began the slow, painstaking work of cross-referencing. She started with the names she knew, the ones with the strange symbols. Jedediah Stone. She found his former property on the map, a neat square bordering what had been her father's land. She took a piece of charcoal from the stove and made a small mark on the map, a simple X. Next, Abigail Finch. Her laundry was a small building on Creek Street. Jane found the lot on the town map inset and marked it. Marcus Thorne, the blacksmith. His smithy and the small house behind it were on the edge of town. Another X. She worked for hours, fueled by stale bread and cold water. The tack room became her world. The rhythmic sounds of the stable, the stomp of a hoof, the swish of a tail, the low murmur of Gus talking to the horses faded into a distant hum. Pilgrim stood watch by the door, his quiet presence a steady anchor. He would occasionally poke his head into the room, nudging her shoulder with his soft nose as if to remind her to rest. She would stroke his face, murmur a few words, and then turn back to her work. As she moved through the ledger, a chilling pattern began to emerge. Every name she found with a cryptic symbol corresponded to a person or family who had fallen on hard times within the last 5 years. They were small ranchers, shopkeepers, families who had lost everything to drought, sickness, or bad luck. And on the map, her charcoal X's were beginning to form a constellation of misfortune, a dark galaxy of loss that spread across the entire county. She found dozens of entries, a baker whose shop had burned down, a farmer whose crop had failed, a freighter whose best team had gone lame. Each one was marked in the ledger with a name, a number, and a unique symbol, a sheaf of wheat, a wagon wheel, a key. She began to understand. The symbols weren't random doodles. They were collateral. The fence post wasn't just a post. It represented Jedediah Stone's land, defined by its fences. The water bucket was Abigail Finch's well, the most valuable part of her laundry business. The branding iron was the smithy himself, the core of his livelihood. Silas Croft hadn't been just a cattle baron. He had been the county's secret banker, its silent, unseen predator. He gave out loans to people in their most desperate moments, not through the bank, but personally. And he didn't secure his loans with legal paperwork filed at the courthouse. He secured them with a name, a number, and a symbol in his private ledger. He owned their debts, and through their debts, he owned them. The realization settled upon her not with a shout, but with a cold, terrifying quiet. She felt as though she were reading a ghost story, the final testament of a man who had collected souls. She kept working, her fingers smudged with charcoal, her eyes burning from the lantern light. The map was now covered in marks, a testament to Croft's silent conquest. Then she turned a page and her breath caught in her throat. There, halfway down the left-hand column, was a name that made her world stop. Elias Alcott, her father. The entry was dated just 3 months before his death, the time he had come home from town looking older, grayer, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He had told her he'd secured a loan to buy feed to get them through the winter, but he'd never said from where. He had only said it came at a high cost. She had thought he meant the interest. Now she saw the truth. Next to his name was the number 1,000, $1,000. It was the exact amount he'd needed. And beside the number was the symbol. It was a small, perfect drawing of a smooth, flat river stone, the kind found only in the creek bed that marked the western boundary of their property. Her father had used one just like it, a stone with a unique white stripe to mark the cornerstone of their homestead when he first filed the claim. It was a detail so specific, so personal, only he and Silas Croft could have known its significance. This book wasn't just a record of liens. It was the liens themselves. In an era where a man's word and a signature were often the law, this ledger, in Croft's own hand, was a binding document. He had never foreclosed on these people through the courts because he hadn't needed to. He held the proof of their debt, and with it, their futures, in his hand. He could call it in at any time, and they would be ruined. And now, that power was in her hands. The weight of the book on her lap felt immense, biblical. It held the fate of dozens of families, her own included. It was a weapon, a key, a burden. She looked from her father's name in the book to the blank space on the map where their ranch used to be, a space now legally owned by the Croft estate. A cold fury, clean and sharp, rose in her. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about justice. A justice her father and so many others had been denied. She traced the drawing of the river stone with her fingertip, a silent promise to the man who had placed it there. The tack room was silent, save for the sound of her own breathing and the steady, sleeping breaths of the old horse just outside her door. The world had laughed at her for buying a worthless book, but they hadn't known. They had been laughing at their own chains, and she was the only one holding the key. A sudden, violent gust of wind slammed against the stable, making the old timbers groan. The gentle night breeze had turned into a low, menacing howl. Jane looked up from the ledger, startled. Through the cracks in the tack room door, she could see not blackness, but a swirling, milky white. A blizzard. It had come out of nowhere, a furious, unseasonable storm sweeping down from the mountains. The temperature in the small room dropped instantly. She quickly stoked the small wood stove, adding the last of her precious firewood. The wind shrieked, and the fine, dry snow began to force its way through every crack and seam in the old building. Pilgrim stamped his feet nervously in his stall, his anxiety a palpable thing. Jane went to him, speaking in low, soothing tones, her hand firm on his neck. Just as she was calming him, the main stable doors burst open with a crash, flung wide by the force of the gale. A man stumbled in, half frozen and covered in snow, shouting over the roar of the wind. Behind him, a woman huddled, clutching a small child. Their wagon, one wheel splintered and broken, was just visible through the white curtain of the storm. "Help us!" the man cried, his voice hoarse. "Our axle broke. We need shelter." Gus was gone for the night, and the stable was otherwise empty. There was no one else. Jane didn't hesitate. "In here," she called, waving them toward the relative warmth of her small tack room. She helped the man, whose name was Thomas, lead his shivering wife, Mary, and their little boy into the room. Mary was pale and clearly exhausted, her pregnancy obvious beneath her heavy coat. Jane settled them on her own cot, wrapping them in her only blankets. She gave them the last of her bread and a tin cup of water, which she heated on the stove. The small room was crowded now, but the presence of the family pushed back against the storm's fury, creating a small island of warmth and safety. Thomas explained they were heading west, hoping to claim a small parcel of land, but the sudden storm had caught them unawares. As Mary and the boy drifted into an exhausted sleep, Thomas sat by the stove, his eyes full of a weary gratitude. He looked at Jane, at her simple cot, and the strange map spread on the floor. "You're being mighty kind to us, miss," he said. "We have nothing to repay you with." "No repayment needed," Jane replied quietly, her eyes on the ledger she had carefully placed on a high shelf, away from the damp. "People have to look out for one another." The storm raged for hours, a relentless assault of wind and snow. In the flickering lantern light, surrounded by the sleeping family she had taken in, Jane felt a profound shift within herself. The ledger was a document of power, a tool of financial leverage. Sterling Croft would have used it to crush people, to expand his inheritance. His father had used it to own them. But as she looked at the vulnerable faces of her guests, she saw another path. The book wasn't just a list of debts. It was a record of community, of shared hardship. It was a map of her neighbors' secret sorrows. Protecting this family felt inextricably linked to protecting the secrets in the book. It wasn't about claiming ownership or settling scores. It was about stewardship. She was the keeper of these stories now, and what she did next would determine if they were stories of ruin or stories of redemption. She had to commit, fully. When the first light of dawn finally broke, painting the snow-covered world in shades of gray and blue, the wind had died, and a deep silence had fallen. The crisis had passed. Jane knew with absolute clarity what she had to do. The town of Cheyenne awoke to a world transformed, buried under 2 feet of pristine, silent snow. The air was sharp and clean. As soon as the roads were passable, Jane left the sleeping family in the care of a now-returned Gus, promising to come back. She wrapped the precious ledger in oilcloth to protect it, and walked the quiet, snow-packed streets to the county courthouse. The county clerk's office was warm, smelling of dry paper and stove smoke. Mr. Abernathy, a man whose life was ruled by the neat lines in his record books, was already at his desk. He was a stern, meticulous man, not known for his patience. He looked up over his spectacles as Jane entered, his expression a mixture of surprise and mild annoyance. "Miss Alcott, what can I do for you?" he asked, his tone suggesting he hoped the answer was nothing. At that moment, The door opened again, and Sterling Croft strode in, brushing snow from the shoulders of his expensive wool coat. He was there to begin filing the probate papers for his father's estate, to officially claim his inheritance. He saw Jane, and a smirk touched his lips. "Still clutching your little scrapbook, I see," he said. "Don't tell me you found a secret treasure map." Jane ignored him. She looked directly at Mr. Abernathy and placed the ledger on the counter between them. "Mr. Abernathy," she said, her voice steady, "I believe this book is a legal record of private loans and liens made by Silas Croft. I need you to verify it." Abernathy raised an eyebrow. Sterling let out a short, barking laugh. "A record of what? That's my father's ranching log. It's worthless. Now, if you'll excuse us, miss, I have actual business to conduct." "Please," Jane insisted, her gaze unwavering, "just look." With a sigh of theatrical impatience, Abernathy pulled the book toward him. He opened it, his eyes scanning the first few pages with a practiced, dismissive air. "I see cattle counts, feed prices. This is exactly what Mr. Croft says it is. A farm ledger." "Keep reading," Jane said softly. "Look for the inconsistencies." To his credit, Abernathy was a man who, above all else, respected the integrity of a record. Something in Jane's tone made him pause. He turned a few more pages. He stopped. His finger traced a line. It was Jedediah Stone's entry. He looked at it for a long time, his brow furrowed in concentration. He then pulled a massive leather-bound county plat book from the shelf behind him and opened it on the counter. The room was silent except for the rustle of paper and the ticking of the grand clock on the wall. Sterling shifted his weight, his amusement fading into irritation. Abernathy ran his finger down a column in the county book, then looked back at the ledger. He flipped a page in Croft's book, found another name, and repeated the process. A strange expression began to dawn on his face. His professional disinterest gave way to a dawning shock, then a profound, solemn gravity. He looked up from the books, his eyes wide. He stared first at Jane, then at Sterling. "My God," he whispered, "it's all here." He began to speak, more to himself than to them. "These symbols, they're collateral. The numbers are the principal. There are notes scribbled in the margins in a personal shorthand. They're the terms of agreement." He looked at Sterling, his face pale. "This isn't just a logbook, Mr. Croft. This appears to be your father's private, legally binding record of dozens, perhaps hundreds, of unrecorded liens against property and assets all over this county. Each entry, in his own hand, constitutes a contract." The rescued stranger, Thomas, appeared at the doorway, having come to thank Jane again. He stood there listening, a witness to the turning of the tide. Sterling Croft stared, his face ashen, the color draining from it as he finally understood. The inheritance he had come to claim was not what he thought. His father's true empire wasn't in land or cattle, but in the debts of his neighbors. And the proof, the sole legal claim to it all, was in the hands of the dusty girl in the oversized coat he had laughed out of the auction house. The town's mockery had fallen silent. The vindication was quiet, absolute, and devastating. The golden hour light slanted across the porch of the Alcott homestead, turning the snow-covered fields into a sea of shimmering gold. A week had passed, a week in which the world had been remade. Jane stood on the familiar wooden planks, her hand resting on the smooth, worn porch rail her father had built. The air was cold and still. The ranch was hers again, the first of the debts to be settled. The ledger had proven her father's loan from Croft was secured only by the property itself, and with Croft's death, The unrecorded lien had become a simple debt against the estate, one she had settled for pennies on the dollar. News had traveled with the speed of a prairie fire. The story of the $11 ledger had become a local legend. People who had once whispered about the foolish girl now spoke her name with a kind of hushed reverence. They came to her, not as supplicants to a new baron, but as neighbors seeking fairness. She met with them one by one in the same courthouse office where her discovery had been validated. With Mr. Abernathy as a witness, she opened the ledger and addressed each debt. For those whose lands had been taken, she used the ledger's power to restore their titles. For those still struggling under the weight of what they owed, she drew up new, fair terms, canceling the predatory interest that had been recorded in Croft's cryptic shorthand. She was not a creditor. She was an archivist of justice, a restorer of balances. Sterling Croft had left town on the first train heading east, his inheritance reduced to a fraction of its expected value, his reputation in tatters. He was humbled, not by force, but by the quiet, undeniable truth written in his own father's hand. Pilgrim grazed peacefully in the near pasture, his head low, his breath misting in the cold air. He was home. Gus, the old stableman, rode up and dismounted, his weathered face etched with a proud smile. He stood beside Jane on the porch, looking out at the land. "Never seen anything like it," he said, his voice full of wonder. "You hold the paper on half the county, Janie. What are you going to do with all that power?" Jane looked down at the green leather ledger she held in her hands. She ran her thumb over the scuffed cover. She thought of the fear in the faces of the family she'd sheltered from the storm, the desperation in her father's eyes, the quiet dignity of the people who had come to her seeking not a handout, but a fair chance. She looked at the vast, beautiful, and unforgiving land that stretched out before her, now stitched back together with threads of hope. "This isn't a weapon, Gus," she said, her voice soft but clear in the evening air. "It's a map home. Thank you for staying with us to the very end of this journey. This has been a story about finding value where no one else can see it, a reminder that true strength often lies in quiet persistence. If you were moved by Jane's story, we'd be so grateful if you'd like this video. Leave a comment and subscribe to our channel for more tales that uncover the hidden heart of history. We have another story coming soon, about a lonely lighthouse keeper who discovers a message in a bottle that will change the fate of a distant kingdom. We'll see you then.